Hello and welcome to the Digital Tutors 3D Texturing in Photoshop Training Kit. In this kit we'll explore many of the tools and a lot of the techniques that can be employed within Photoshop to create realistic and detailed textures for your 3D models. Okay, so here's the model we're going to be working with, and this monster was built in the Digital Tutors Fundamentals of Polygon and Subdivision Modeling Training Kit. And then we also went through the process of making a pretty extensive UV layout for this creature in the Fundamentals of UV Layout training kit. So here we're going to go ahead and continue working with this creature to build the textures for it using Photoshop. So a lot of techniques to cover within this kit. Things like adding these little skin blemishes to the skin, lip textures, creating folds and wrinkles within the texture. Also taking a look at common problems such as this, where you have textures that stretch and warp, going through some of the process and some of the technique of how to fix some of these very, very common issues, as well as one of the most common issues, which is this area right here. If you look, you can see that there's a seam in the texture, and this is being caused by where two UV layouts are touching, where you have the UV layout for the arm of this creature connecting with the UV layout for the body. And typically that will result in a seam or a line of some sort. So one of the things that we will focus on in this training kit is using Photoshop to get something more like this, where you have pretty much a seamless blend between the two portions of the body. So lots and lots of stuff to cover in this kit. So in the next video, we'll go ahead and get started. Before we get started painting the textures for our monster, we need to take a moment to get the UV snapshot from our 3D application into Photoshop, so we can then use that UV snapshot as a basis for creating our textures. Okay, so in this case, the 3D application that we're going to be using is Maya. Okay, and if you're using Maya, you can go ahead and open up the texturing start.ma. Okay, and that'll be our starting scene that we're going to be working with. Okay, so selecting this object, this is a subdivision surface. So we can take a look at the UV snapshot of this object by going up to Window, and then about halfway down, you can look at the UV texture editor. Okay, and now you can see the UV layout that we created for this monster in an earlier kit. Okay, from this point, you have really one of two options as a way of getting this texture back into Photoshop. You can either go up to Polygons and select the UV snapshot, which if you click on that, you now have the option to determine where that file is going to go and what the name is going to be, what the size of this texture is going to be once it's imported into Photoshop. You can choose the file format, and you can also choose what color the wireframe is going to be when this comes into Photoshop. Okay, so that's one way to do that through the UV snapshot. Another option that you have, if you're using Maya 6.0 or later, is let's go ahead and open up the Hypershade. Okay, and like I said, if you're running Maya 6.0 or later, within the Hypershade, if you go to Edit, you should see an option called Create Photoshop Document Texture. Okay, this is the option that we're going to be using. And this option will work if you're using, I believe it's Photoshop 6 or later. If you're using anything earlier than version 6, I'm not sure if this Create PSD Texture will work. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is let's assign a new material to our monster. Okay, so in this case I'm just going to use a blend, and we can go ahead and name this something like Monster Body. Okay, now let's go ahead and select this surface, and we can go up to Edit, and let's create a PSD texture. Okay, and when you click on that, it brings up this window, which will give you a few options to choose from. So in the image name, we can choose exactly where we want this to go. Okay, so I'm going to create it, or I'm going to add this to my textures folder, and I'll just call this Monster Body. Okay, Now that will be the name of the Photoshop document that we can open. You can set the size for this, and since I want this to be a fairly detailed texture, I'm going to go ahead and set this to a pretty large size. In this case, 2048. Okay, we can select the attributes that we want to add to this texture that we're going to be making. So let's add color. I also would like this creature to be able to have a bump map. So let's go ahead and add a bump map. And I want to be able to add some specular color to this creature at some point in time. So I'll add that. Okay, so let's go ahead and just work with these three attributes for our monster. You can set, right in here, you can set what color the wireframe is going to be once this comes into Photoshop. I'm going to go ahead and just leave this white. White seems to be a pretty good color. Okay, so once we've got all this set, we can create. Okay, and give it just a moment to compute this. Okay, so if you take a look in your Hypershade, here's what you wind up with. Here's what Maya's done. It's gone ahead and basically automatically made these three different images, which are all part of the same Photoshop document. Okay, so what we can do is if we take a look at Photoshop, let's go ahead and open, and here is the monster body Photoshop document that we just made. Okay, so if we open this, here's what we've got, ready to be painted on. And the reason that this works with Photoshop 6 or later is because this creates what are called layer sets. And so you have one layer set for the body color, one layer set for the bump, one for the specular, and whatever other attributes you decided to add. And layer sets are a feature that are new in Photoshop version 6. So anything newer than or anything older than 6, I'm not sure how well that works. Okay, so now that we've got this brought into Photoshop, we're ready to go ahead and start painting, which we can get started on in our next video. Now that we have the UV snapshot imported into Photoshop, we're ready to start the process of painting the textures for our monster. Okay, so let's go ahead and open up Photoshop. And one of the first things you're probably going to need to do if you're working with a layered Photoshop texture from Maya is you'll probably need to go ahead and collapse these layer sets for things like the specular and the bump, because it's probably going to put the body color layer set at the very bottom. And right now we really can't see that because these other two layer sets are in the way. So let's go ahead and just turn off the visibility for these two layer sets, and that way we can work with the color. Okay, if you look at the very top of your layer stack, you can see a layer called UV snapshot. And that UV snapshot is actually the wireframe of this UV layout from Maya. Okay, and this wireframe is what we'll use as the basis for all the textures that we're going to make within this kit. Okay, so looking at the body layer set, let's go ahead and start to add just a very base color for this creature. So the color for this creature I want to be sort of a bluish purple color, or sort of a grayish purple. Okay, so what we can do is click on this black swatch, and that'll bring up this color picker. Okay, let's go ahead and choose a color sort of right about in the area where this purple and the blue start to meet. Okay, something kind of over here. And let's just sort of pick something that's a very grayish purple. Okay, something in this area, or about this color. Or if you wanted to, you could actually take note of these RGB values and just plug in something similar into your Photoshop document. Okay, so let's hit OK. Okay, now what we can do is let's go ahead and fill this gray layer with this purple color that we just selected. Okay, so let's go ahead and just choose our paint bucket tool. We'll paint this. Okay, and now this layer 1 is this gray, or this sort of purplish gray skin tone. Okay, while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and take this layer 1, just double click on it, and I'm going to go ahead and just rename this to something like skin base. Okay, I always try and make it habit to go in and rename these layers as I work with it, and it'll really make it just a lot easier to work with, especially once we get 10, 15, 20 layers within here. It'll be really nice to be able to have these named. Okay, so now that we've got this purple color selected, what I would really like to do is go in and add a little bit of color variation to this skin. So that way we're not left with just this very plastic looking skin tone. Okay, so let's go back over to our color chooser. Okay, we'll click on this little double-sided arrow up in the corner, and that will switch these colors around. Okay, so now with this white color active, let's click on this. And what I want to be able to do is pick a color that's a little bit darker than this purple color that we've already got. Okay, so with this color picker active, let's go ahead and just sample this purple color. Okay, and that'll go ahead and give us our starting point. And let's just go ahead and now select a color that's a bit darker than what we started out with. Okay, hit OK. And now you can see this darker purple color that we've got selected. Okay, so with these two colors set as your foreground and background color, and let's go ahead and make sure that we've got this skin base layer selected. Let's now go up to Filter, Noise, and let's add a little bit of noise to this. Okay, I want to make sure that I have this noise set to Gaussian, and let's go ahead and make it monochromatic. Okay, otherwise, if it's not monochromatic, you'll get this multicolored spotting happening, and that's really not what I want. So I want to go ahead and make this monochromatic, and that way I'll make sure that this is just black and white. Okay, let's go ahead and give this something like, about 20%. Hit OK. And now if I zoom in on this, you can see the texture that it's added. Okay, but it's definitely a long ways from being a skin texture. Okay, so with this skin base layer still selected, the layer that we just added this noise to, let's go back up to Filter, and now let's blur this out and really soften this up. So I'm going to go back to Gaussian blur. Okay, and let's adjust this value until we find something that's adds just these really subtle sort of skin tones. Okay, in my case, this is going to be something around a 5 pixel radius. Okay, I'll go ahead and hit OK. And now what we have is just a little bit of subtle skin variation that we can then use to build on top of for some of our more detailed skin tones. Okay, so if I wanted to take a look at how this looks on our 3D creature, all I have to do now is just simply save this. Okay, and now we can go back to Maya, and under the Hypershade, let's go to Edit, and let's update PSD Textures. Okay, we'll give this just a second. And now if we take a look at our creature, we can see what this texture looks like on our creature. Okay, so now that we have this set as a starting point, in the next video we can go in and start to add some more detail to this skin texture. In the previous video, we started to add some of the basic skin tones for our monster. Now we can go in and begin the process of adding some of the colors to the areas that we want. Okay, so let's go ahead and start back off with Photoshop. Okay, and here's where we left off in the last video with just the basic skin texture. The area that I want to go in and start to add a little bit of color to now is actually this channel that's in the side of his head. And if I take a look at our 3D model, that's actually this area right here that runs up along and down the side of his head. Okay, so let's go to Photoshop, and that's actually, like I said, this area of the UV layout. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is choose a color that I want to be able to make this. So let's say something that's a very, very pale white, almost a gray. Okay, so let's try and find something sort of a medium gray, almost a very light gray. Okay, so maybe 185 for RGB. Okay, so once I have this light gray color selected, what I want to be able to do is add this onto another layer. Okay, so let's go ahead and make a new layer. Okay, and I'll call this channel, just so I can sort of keep these straight. And what I want to do now is now pick a brush size that corresponds with this. Okay, so let's go ahead and pick a paintbrush. And what I'll do is I can go up to Window, Brushes. Okay, or you should actually, if you're using a larger display resolution, you should be able to see some tabs up in this upper corner of Photoshop that also has this Brushes tab built into it. But since I'm working with a smaller resolution, those are actually getting cut off on my screen. Okay, so what we can do is just try and pick a brush size that fits pretty well in this area. Okay, that's not bad. So it looks like for me that's going to be about a size 45 brush. Okay, so a few options that I want to be able to change really quickly is I'm actually, first of all, I'm not actually using a mouse to paint these textures. I'm using a Wacom digital tablet with a pen. So I actually really enjoy using this because it has a very natural feel to it of a pen and pencil. And the other thing is it's actually pressure sensitive. So I can determine based on how hard or how soft I push on this tablet, I can control the size of my brush based on how hard I push on this tablet. Or I also have control over all of these different things within Photoshop. I can control the opacity of my brush stroke, which these are things that you really just don't have any control over with just a mouse. Okay, so to paint this, I'm actually going to turn off this shape dynamics, and I want to turn on color dynamics within this brushes palette. Okay, for the opacity, I'm going to link this to the pen pressure, so that way as I make a really light stroke on this tablet, we get very little paint, but as I push harder, more paint will be applied, and then as I let off, it tapers off again. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and now, with everything set, we can go ahead and just close this palette, and now on this channel layer, I can go in and just start to paint the areas that I want. Now right now this UV snapshot, this wireframe is a little bit too opaque, so I'm actually just going to take this and lower the opacity of this UV snapshot layer, just so it's a little easier to see exactly what I'm doing. Okay, and what I'm going to do is just with a light stroke at first, come in and start to paint some of this, and then come in with a little harder stroke and fill this in. Okay, so I'm just going to really slowly work my way around. Okay, and you can definitely, you don't have to have a Wacom tablet to be able to make these textures. It just definitely makes it a lot easier. These can definitely be done with a mouse. It just sometimes is a little bit more intuitive and definitely a lot faster and easier if you had access to a Wacom tablet. Okay, so I'm just going to use this wireframe as just more or less a guide to paint the texture that I want. Okay, and before I go in and add too much detail to this, let's go ahead and see how this looks on our 3D model. Okay, so we can go ahead and save this. And now we can just go back to Maya. Go ahead and go back to our Hypershade. Let's update the PSD textures. Give this just a second. And now we can see how this looks on our 3D model. Okay, and it looks like everything fits pretty well. Okay, so now that I've got this set, I can go in and start to add a bit more detail into the texture of this side channel, which we can start to do that now in the next video. Before we move any further in our texturing, let's discuss a common problem that we'll probably come upon when using Photoshop document textures within Maya. Okay, so let's take a look at where we left off. We had the skin base, and then we came in and painted this channel texture on top of it. Okay, and if we take a look at our Maya scene, this is what we get. Okay, and we can take a look at the PSD color file, right here, and everything looks pretty normal. Okay, but if we go back to Photoshop, and let's say that on this channel layer, we actually wanted to make it a little bit transparent so that a little bit more of the skin texture shows through. Well, right now, if we were to lower the opacity of this and then save our Photoshop document, okay, let's go back into Maya. Let's update this, and we'll see an issue right away. Okay, and that is that our channel texture has turned yellow. Okay, and this is just a inconsistency with the Photoshop document being imported into Maya, just different file formats. There is, though, a way to fix this problem. What we can do is go back to Photoshop, and in this channel texture, let's go ahead and make a new layer just above it. Okay, it doesn't really matter what the layer is called. Now what we can do is select this new layer and the channel layer and link these together. Okay, and we can do that by just clicking on this little box next to the icon. Okay, and now what we can do is in this menu up in the upper corner of the layers palette, we can merge linked, or I usually just use the shortcut Control E. Okay, so let's merge these linked layers, and by linking these and merging these, what we now have is this same channel texture, but since it was merged with another layer, now this resets back to 100% opacity. Okay, so even though, let me just go ahead and undo this step, we had our channels layer set to about 50% opacity, the layer above it is 100%. Okay, so we link these two layers, and now this merged layer now becomes 100% opacity. Okay, so with this merged down, we can go ahead and save this, and now when we reload, everything should be okay. Okay, there we go. Now that's had a chance to update, and now we have this texture with a little bit of transparency in it, which is really what we need. Another thing that I want to do before we move on is it is getting pretty tedious to have to come into our Hypershade and update this PSD texture all the time. What I really would like to be able to do is just simply make a shelf icon out of that. So that way I can go ahead and just stay in my perspective view all the time. I never have to go back to my Hypershade. So let's go ahead and make a shelf icon out of this update PSD textures command. Okay, so what we can do is let's click on the script editor button down here in the lower corner, and it's probably got quite a bit of stuff already in there from all the work that we've been doing since the beginning of this scene. So what we can do to go ahead and clear this out, let's go up to Edit, and let's clear the history. Okay, that'll go ahead and just clear this out for us. Now, in order to get this command to register in the script editor, what we need to do is under Script, let's turn on Echo All Commands. Okay, now with this Echo All Commands turned on, what we can do is go up to Edit PSD Textures, click on it, and that Update PSD Textures registers in the script editor. We can now see the command that was just executed, which this is it here. So what we can do now is just take this, let's highlight this, and middle click, and drag it up to the shelf. Okay, so now I never have to leave my perspective view. I've got now that Update PSD Textures in my shelf icon. So for me, since I'm working in this pretty limited space, that's going to really be helpful. And overall, it's just gonna probably be a big time saver for you, because you now no longer have to go through and dig through this menu to find what you're looking for. Okay, so now that we've got everything squared away, in the next video we'll go ahead and start to add some more detail to this texture. In this video, we'll go back to Photoshop and begin painting some more details into the head of our creature. Okay, so here's where we left off with the texturing portion, and what I want to do now is to be able to go back into this channel that's in the side of his head and start to go in and maybe add a few veins and a couple of wrinkles in a few areas, just to start to add a little bit more detail as we go. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is go ahead and just make a new layer, and I can go ahead and call these something like channel veins. Okay, just so I know what this layer is, and I'll start off with just a black color. Okay, zoom in a little bit on this, and maybe lower the opacity on this wireframe a little bit. Okay, so let's take a look now at a brush size. Okay, so I want to go ahead and select my paintbrush, and let's see, number 3, maybe a little bit big. Let's try 2. Yeah, I like that. Okay, and again, I'm using a Wacom tablet, so I can come in and use real light pressure to get a real small stroke, press a little harder to get a harder stroke, and then let off to sort of taper this out. It makes it really easy and really quick to come in and just do little veins, just a couple of lines here and there. Okay, so I'll come in and just really quickly paint in a couple of lines here. And what you'll probably want to do, and something to definitely be aware of, is to look at the direction of your wireframe on your UV snapshot, and use that more or less as a reference to the direction that these veins are going to have to take. Okay, so I'm just, like I said, going to continue drawing some of these veins out. Okay, and I won't necessarily go all the way up. Like I said, I'll try and make this look almost like a membrane that is sort of being stretched across this area. So I'll just start off with a few strokes here and there, and then we can come in and I'll just use a real light little bit of a paint stroke to just come in and fill in some of these other areas. Okay, once I've got this done, I can go ahead and save this so we can see how this is going to look. We go back to Maya and let's reload this PSD texture. Give this just a second. Now we can see how that looks. And I'm actually pretty happy with that. So now we've actually managed to get these veins running up this membrane, more or less, that's on the side of his head. Okay, so in the next video, we'll start to focus on adding some secondary tones to this skin to really give it a lot more depth, because it's definitely still lacking in color and just variation. So in the next video, we'll go ahead and focus on that. In the previous video, we added the veins for the side of the head. So in this video, we'll go ahead and begin adding some darker blotches to the overall skin tone of the face. Okay, so here's where we left off in Photoshop. Okay, so we've got the base color for the skin, we've got the veins painted in for the side of the head. Now we can go in and start to add these darker blotches to kind of give this skin a little bit more variation. Okay, so I'm going to make a new layer, and we can go ahead and just call this dark blotches, or just something to where you can tell what it is. Oh, misspelled blotches here. Try that again. Okay, so we've got our new layer made, and what I want to do is pick a color that's a little bit darker than our overall skin tone. Okay, so what I can do is just go to my color picker. Let's just choose, I don't know, one of the darker areas of this. Okay, and we'll just make this a little bit darker. Okay, so now that we've got a darker purple color chosen, now what we need to do is go in and fine-tune a brush that will work for these darker blotches. Okay, so first thing, let's go ahead and select the brush tool. Let's go to Window, and let's take a look at the brushes and see what we have to choose from. Okay, what I'm going to do is just go up to the brush presets, and let's first of all try to find a brush that will work for sort of these just skin blotches. Okay, so let's take a look at this one. Oh, shifted on me a little bit. Let's go back down, and I believe it's this one, the Splatter 46 pixels. That's actually pretty close to what we need. It's a decent size, not too large, not too small, and we can definitely, I think, make this work. So with this Splatter number 46 brush selected, let's go down to the brush tip shape. Okay, now we have a whole lot of options that we can adjust from here. One of the things that we can adjust is the spacing, which by default it's going to be set to very low, so you wind up with one continuous streak. But we really don't want that. We really want something that's a little bit more natural looking. So let's first of all take this spacing up quite a ways. Usually when making these skin tones, I try to adjust it to the point where these different brush patterns just barely start to touch and overlap. Okay, so in this case it's going to be about 60%. Something kind of like this. Okay, from this point we still have a little bit of adjusting to make because it definitely still looks like a repeating pattern. Okay, so let's go over to Shape Dynamics. Okay, and as soon as I click on Shape Dynamics, you can see how in my preview window this updated to this tapered stroke. And that's because I'm using this Wacom tablet. It automatically picks up that pen sensitivity. And in this case, the size jitter is going to be set to pen pressure for me. So if I turn that pen pressure off, now it goes back to that full-size stroke. Okay, if you wanted to, you could actually adjust this size jitter so that every paint dot that it puts down is a little different size. Okay, I actually don't want that though. The one that I want to adjust is angle jitter. And as I take this angle jitter up, you can see how it's rotating each one of these different instances of this paintbrush. Okay, so if I go ahead and take this angle jitter all the way up, you can see now it's got a very random feel to it, which is a little bit more natural. Okay, but we can still get a little bit better, I think. I think if we go to Scatter and give this just a little bit of scatter, let's take a look at this. Okay, that's not bad. We can make that work. Okay, so in order to finish this off, let's go down to Other Dynamics. Okay, and for me, I'm going to link the opacity to my pen pressure. So that way as I push really, really lightly, I can manage to sort of taper these blotches off and really blend them in to the skin tone. Okay, so pen pressure is linked to opacity, and on my darker blotches layer, now what I can do is just start to slowly, very lightly come in, and then start to increase the pressure, and just sort of darken up a few areas. So I'll come in and darken up these areas over the eyes, sort of in this eyebrow area. I can come in and start to add some blotches down the center portion of the head and just sort of bring that out a little bit. And again, I'll kind of taper these off as I go and try to blend this in and make it look as natural as I can. Okay, and we can definitely come back and refine these probably in the next video. Okay, so now I'll come in and make just a few more quick blotches, like say around the lips. Kind of darken up that lip area a little bit more. Okay, and I'm using just sort of a medium pressure right now, not really pushing very hard. Okay, so I'll go ahead and continue all the way up and around, and pretty much all the way completely around the lips. Okay, so I'll go ahead and meet up in this area where I left off. So now, if I go ahead and were to turn off this UV snapshot, you can sort of see where we're at. Now, still doesn't look like much, but we can definitely add on to this in the next few videos. But let's go ahead and see how this looks so far. Let's go ahead and save this. We'll go back to Maya, preview this, and see if things are going the direction that we want before we get too far into it. Okay, so now we've actually, you can see where these darker areas have now been added to this color. So in the next video, we'll spend some more time refining these blotches and probably adding further blotches to the skin. In the previous video, we began the process of adding some of the darker blotches to the face of our monster. So in this video, we'll go ahead and refine those blotches and try to make them look a little bit more natural. Okay, so here's where we left off in the last video, starting to add some of these darker blotches to the brow and center part of the head, as well as some of the lip area. So in this video, we'll go ahead and, like I said, start to refine those areas a little bit further. Okay, so first thing I want to do is start to define some of these darker areas of the brow a little bit more. So what I want to do is, with this number 46 splatter brush still selected, I want to go ahead and make this brush a little bit smaller so I can go in and add a little bit more detailed shading in the areas that I want. Okay, so to do that, I'm going to go to Window, and let's open up that Brushes palette. Okay, or like I said a little earlier, you probably will actually be able to see a dock over here that has this Brushes tab in it if you're working in a larger resolution. Okay, so what we can do is this diameter, let's go ahead and just take this down to a smaller number. Okay, something like 19 looks pretty good. And doing it this way through the Brushes palette, by just lowering this diameter, we go ahead and we keep all of these other attributes intact. Nothing else will change, only the size of the brush. Okay, so now that we've just lowered the diameter, we can go in now and probably even on a new layer, just to be on the safe side, we can go in and start to add a little bit more definition to some of these shaded areas. Okay, we could taper this off a little bit more. Actually, I'm going to undo that. Okay, so I'm going to use some pretty heavy pressure right in these areas to sort of add this illusion, more or less, of a raised ridge. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and make a little bit more of a ridge up the side. And like I said, I'm using a little bit heavier pressure on this outer part, like I said, just to sort of give the illusion of a raised ridge right in this area. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now I can go in and maybe start to add a little bit more darkness to this lip area. Okay, like I said, and now that I'm using a smaller brush, I can control that a little bit more. Okay, and one thing, just sort of an artistic preference of mine, whenever I'm making some of these areas that need to blend pretty smoothly from one end to the other, I tend to use these circular motions with the pen, and that seems to make it a bit easier, at least for me it does, to make these areas that blend in a little bit better, as opposed to using either a side-to-side or an up-and-down stroke with either your mouse or your pen. I tend to use these round strokes. Okay, so let's take a look at what we've got. Let's go ahead and save this. Go back to Maya, load this up. Okay, so you can start to see how we've, started the process of maybe creating an illusion of a raised ridge, and it started to add a little bit more darkness to these lips. Okay, so with this done, we can go in and start to now add some lighter blotches to the skin. Okay, so in the next video, let's go ahead and start to add some lighter blotches in the areas that we need them. Now that we've added the darker blotches to the face of our monster, we're ready to now go in and add some lighter blotches to add even further depth to the skin. Okay, so here's where we left off in the last video with refining some of these darker blotches. Okay, so let's first of all go ahead and save this color that we were working with to make the darker blotches in case we ever need to come back and do some further work. Okay, so what we can do is open up this swatches palette. Okay, and with this active, we can go ahead and select the paintbrush tool. Let's add this to our palette, and we can just simply call this dark blotch, or whatever you want to name it. Okay, we'll go ahead and click OK, and now that color's been stored as a swatch that we can use at any time. Okay, so let's go ahead and make a new layer, and this layer will be for the lighter blotches. Okay, and let's go ahead and select a lighter color to be able to work with, and let's go ahead and try and pick something that's pretty close to that gray color that we used for the membrane on the side of the head. So sort of a lighter gray. Okay, let's go ahead and switch back to our paintbrush tool and open up the brushes palette. Okay, let's go ahead and on this splatter number 46 brush, let's go ahead and take the diameter back up to something like 46. We're pretty close to it. Okay, let's see how this is going to look. Make sure everything's still pretty much how it needs to be. And actually, it looks like that number jumped up a little bit. Let me take that back to 46. Okay, that's actually pretty good. I'll go ahead and use this as my lighter blotches. Okay, so this splatter 46 with all the adjustments that we made in the earlier video. Okay, so similar to what we did before, I'm going to go ahead and actually zoom out a little bit and use this to add just a little bit of color just kind of everywhere. Okay, and I'm just going to go really lightly over pretty much the entire face. As I mentioned before, I tend to use these circular patterns because they really make it easier to blend in some of these colors. Let's see, because I accidentally turned off the visibility of one of my layers. Okay, so once I've got a little bit of lighter color just sort of scattered throughout this this creature, now what I can do is go in and do something pretty similar to what we did with the darker colored blotches, which is now we can go in, lower the brush size. Let's take this back down to a pretty small number, let's say about 15. And now we can go in, like I said, just with like we did with the darker blotches, and start to add a little bit more detail in the areas that we need. So one area that I would like to get a little bit more of a lighter color on is this ridge that we're starting to build, kind of right in the middle of the head. Use some of these lighter blotches to add sort of a false highlight to the inside of this, and maybe even a little bit of a false highlight right down the center. Okay, let me go ahead and move up a little bit. Let's take a look at this. And looks like this probably needs to be tapered a little bit more. This lighter color looks like it's coming to an end fairly abruptly. Okay, let me go ahead and add just a little bit more. Maybe this lighter streak that we're starting to bring down the middle of his head. I'll very, very lightly, with almost no pen pressure at all, just try and taper this out a little bit and sort of try to blend some of these skin tones together. Okay, so let's go ahead and just really quickly take a look at what we've got. I'll go ahead and save this. We'll jump back over to Maya, reload this Photoshop texture, and let's see how things are going. Okay, so here's what we've got. And you can see how we're starting to now build up this skin ridge. in the middle of his forehead. Okay, so that's coming along pretty nicely. And I'm not too satisfied with this center part. It looks like it's coming to an end awfully abruptly. So let me go back to Photoshop and let's see what we can do to fix that. Okay, that's actually this area right here. Let's try switching to our eraser tool. Okay, and with the eraser tool selected, let's go to brushes. Okay, I'm going to select other dynamics, and I want the opacity set to the pen pressure. Okay, that way the harder I push, the more it erases. And what I can usually do is use something like that, push real lightly on the edges, and then start to push a little harder as I get more toward the center, and just very, very lightly start to erase some of these areas away. Okay, so let's save this. Okay, so before I reload this, here's what the original ridge looked like. Let's reload this and see how that looks. Okay, that's much better. That's much more natural now. Okay, so in the next video, we'll go ahead and start to now add some of the creases around the lips. At this point in the training kit, we're ready to begin adding some of the creases and the subtle wrinkles to the lips to give them a little bit more depth and just a little bit more dimension. Okay, so let's go ahead and start things off with Photoshop. Okay, and the area that we're going to be working with is right around this bottom part of the lip, around this border line. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is let's make a new layer, and this will be for the lip creases. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and leave it as this lighter color, but we're going to need to make some adjustments to our brush. Okay, and these really don't need to be super detailed little lip creases, so we really don't need to go in and spend the time fine-tuning this brush in the brushes palette. What we could do instead is just simply go up to this brush pull-down menu, and let's try to find a brush size that's suitable for what we need to do. So let's see what 2 looks like. 2 actually seems like it's a little bit big. Yeah, I believe 2 is going to be a little bit large, so we may have to go to a 1 pixel brush. Okay, that's what we're going to have to do. Okay, so let's go ahead and double check this brush that we have selected. We want to make sure that shape dynamics is turned on, so that way it tapers as I go, and that's really about all that we need. Okay, so let's go ahead and start to make our marks. Okay, so let's go ahead and just start by drawing some of these lip creases. Okay, and you probably want to make sure that you try to pretty closely follow the direction that these UV lines are going. So try to pay attention to that, otherwise these lip creases really aren't going to follow the direction of the lip. Okay, so we'll go ahead and continue drawing some of these. And like I said, when you're using a pen, this is going to go much faster when than if you were using just a mouse or something like that. And also the fact that it gives you a little bit more control over the width of your stroke based on how hard you press. That's going to make definitely make things easier. Okay, so I'm not going to go all the way around just because you probably get the idea of where I'm going with this. But now what we probably need to do is go in and soften these up a little bit. Okay, so if I were to turn this off, turn the wireframe off, you can see these are pretty hard lines as they start. They don't really taper in or fade in at all. So what I'm probably going to have to do is switch to my eraser tool. Okay, and let's go ahead and go to the brushes palette with this eraser tool selected. And for me, I'm going to go ahead and link this to my pen pressure, link the opacity to my pen pressure. Okay, and also I've actually got the opacity up here set a little bit lower also. So with this setup, even if I press as hard as I possibly can, it's still only going to go at about 25% opacity. And that really gives me a chance to just really lightly taper these out. Okay, so I'm just going to go over these really lightly with my eraser tool and just start to fade out the top parts of this stroke and really just try and blend these in to the skin. Like I said, just so that these look a little bit more natural than what they probably would otherwise. Okay, so let's go in and grab these also. Okay, like I said, I'll go ahead and use my eraser tool and just work my way around. Okay, so let's take a look at how this looks. I'll go ahead and save this. Jump back to Maya. Let's reload this Photoshop texture. Okay, so now you can start to see where these lip creases are starting to come in. And since they fade pretty naturally up into the skin, this doesn't look too bad, and this will really look good once we start to get a bump map on this at a later point in time. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and pause the video and just continue making these lip creases all the way around. And then in the next video, we'll start to add some further creases to the skin. In this video, we're ready to go ahead and start to add some of the creases to the eyes, as well as start to add some creases to the corner of the mouth and add just a few more slight details to the face before we move on to the rest of the body. Okay, so here's where we left off in Maya. So what we want to do is go in and just add a few more creases here to the corner of the eye and also up here to this corner area of the mouth. Okay, so let's go back to Photoshop and take a look at where we need to be. Okay, so here's the corner of the eye that I want to go ahead and add this to. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new layer. And I'll just call it corner of the eye. Okay, so let's go ahead and use pretty much a similar technique to what we did with the lips. We'll go ahead and just switch to a paintbrush tool. Let's say a 1 pixel. Let's try that out. Okay, so what we can do is let's start right here at this. It's gonna be a little bit difficult for you to see, but we're gonna start right at this corner of the eye, and then try and continue up along this line up to about this area here, and then make a few other lines that come out from this corner of the eye also. Okay, so I'll switch back to my paintbrush tool, and usually when I'm using this Wacom tablet, in order to get that taper, what I'll do is actually start at the end of the wrinkle with very light pressure and then actually start to increase the pressure as I bring it in, and that way I can get what looks like a nice tapered off wrinkle. Okay, so let's go ahead and I'll go ahead and do that. So I'll start right about here, start with a light pressure and start to increase the pressure as I come in. And if I go ahead and turn off the UV snapshot, you can see what I'm left with. Okay, and that's usually my workflow for making wrinkles and little creases like that. Just go ahead and start real light and then start to increase as you bring it in. Okay, we'll make a few more of these. And you'll probably want to try to, as much as possible, try to follow the contours of these UV layouts that we've made, because that's going to determine the direction that this texture actually flows. So if you have these wrinkles that aren't staying on these lines, what you're going to wind up with is these lines not really following the contours of the body correctly. So in this same layer, what we can do is go ahead and start to add the creases for the corner of the mouth. And for these creases on the corner of the mouth, I'm actually going to raise this up to a 2 pixel. Okay, now let's go ahead and try the same technique. Let's start with a real soft pen pressure, increase it toward the middle of the wrinkle, and then at the end of the wrinkle, let off on your pen pressure. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that a few more times. Just add a few more wrinkles here and there, and as I'm I'm going to go ahead and start to bring these wrinkles back a little further, and as I come back further, I'm going to use a much lighter pressure and just try and taper these wrinkles off. Okay, and I'm actually not too happy with that. Let me go ahead and undo these a few more steps. Try this again. I really wasn't too happy with the multiple wrinkles. I was getting almost too many wrinkles there. So let's try this again. Like I said, I'll try and taper these off a little bit more as I go, so that way these wrinkles sort of fade out. And if you start to come into areas like this where you find that the wrinkle maybe is a little bit too, comes to maybe too much of an abrupt end, what we could always do is switch to our smudge tool. Okay, and then we could always take our smudge tool and maybe soften this up a little bit. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at what we've got. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and save this. Now let's go ahead and jump over to Maya. Okay, let's reload this. Okay, so you can start to see now the wrinkles that we've started to build up around the eye and around the lip. Okay, so at this point, I want to go ahead and take a break from the face, and what I really want to do is start to focus in on some of these areas of the body, like the claws, getting some of this real detailed claw texture on these, also some of the knuckles and the folding and the creasing of the skin around the elbows, and just overall adding some more detail to this body. So in the next video, we'll go ahead and continue that process. At this point in the training kit, we're going to go ahead and pause working on the face for right now and go ahead and start to do some work on the feet as far as getting the claw textures ready to go. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to Photoshop, and the area that we're going to be working with in this video is the claws. Okay, and that's actually these more spread out UVs, this area right in here. Okay, so let's go ahead and make a new layer. Okay, we'll call this, let's call this claw. Okay, so in this claw layer, let's try to pick a color that's kind of yellow. Okay, maybe got a little bit of a gray to it. Let's try something sort of like this, maybe even a little bit lighter to start out as the base color. Okay, so let's say like 185, pretty much all the way through for RG and B. Okay, let's go ahead and we'll pick just a nice solid brush color. Okay, so now in this claw layer, what we can do is just come in and paint this yellow color in right at the very tip of these claws. Okay, and we're going to have to do that on all four of these claws. Now you're going to want to make sure, like what has happened here, that I've went outside of this white boundary with this yellow. If that ever does happen, what we'll probably have to do is probably follow up with the eraser tool, and we could always come back and just erase this out. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue back around with the paint tool. Go ahead and we'll go ahead and get all the claws on all of these feet. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get this claw. Continue on around with this one. Let's grab this. And like I said, you'll probably need to follow up in a few places with your eraser tool just to make sure that you don't go beyond this boundary, because otherwise what will happen is you'll get this claw texture fading in and actually bleeding over into the skin in a few places. Okay, so let's go ahead and get this foot. Go ahead and get that one. And it looks like I'm probably going to have to follow up with the eraser tool in a couple of places. Okay, one shortcut that is very useful whenever using your eraser tool or your paintbrush tool for that matter is holding the shift key. So go ahead and make your initial click, hold down on the shift key, and then click again. And what this will do is go ahead and connect the 2 points where you've just clicked. And what that will really let us do is these areas that where we need to follow these straight lines to very easily do that. So if we have to paint very precisely along this straight line, we can just click once, hold the shift key, and then click again on this side, and Photoshop will pretty much go in and do all the work for us as far as removing all the paint in between. Really nice and handy to have. Okay, so let's go ahead and zoom out, make sure we didn't miss anything. Okay, looks like we got one more left to do. Go ahead and paint this guy up. Let's go ahead and get this last texture done. Okay, so now let's go ahead and save this and see how this looks on our claws. Reload this texture, give it a moment to load up. Okay, so now our claws actually have a bit of color to them. And I'm just going to look over this real quick and make sure I don't have any color from the claws bleeding over into the foot. Okay, everything looks okay there. Alright, so in the next video we'll continue adding some detail to this claw texture. Now that we have the claw texture for the toes built, we can go in and start to use Photoshop to add more detail and really start to finish off the look and add some realism to the claws of our creature. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to Photoshop, and in the previous video we went in and made just the rough color for the claws. So what we can do now is start to go in and add some more detail to this. So the first thing I want to do is actually choose a little bit darker color than what I have right now. Okay, so let's go quite a bit darker. Maybe something like this. Okay, and now what I want to do is start to add what looks like a little bit of grittiness toward the back part of this claw. So what I want to do is actually, with my brush tool, let's first of all pick a softer brush. Maybe looks like a 21 is pretty good. Okay, now what I actually want to do is make a few adjustments to this. Again, since I'm using a Wacom tablet, I have the ability to come in and adjust the dynamics, and what I actually want to do is link the pen pressure to the opacity. Okay, and with that done, what I can do is come in and just really quickly add a little bit of darkness to the base of this claw. But I run into a problem here, and that is that I really don't want this darker area to go beyond this white line. Okay, so how can I fix that? Well, what I can do is on this claw layer, there is an option in Photoshop called Preserve Transparency, or Lock Transparent Pixels. So if I click on this and now draw on this claw layer, the paint's only going to stay within the area that already has paint. So what I can do is just really quickly come in and, with this Lock Transparent Pixels turned on, come in and just really quickly add a little bit of shading to the back side of these claws, and it really just will make things happen a lot faster. Okay, so I'll go ahead and just continue to do this to the claws. And like I said, I'm able to use the pen to control how much ink gets applied to these areas. So I can press really hard toward the back and then let off my pressure as I move forward to make a nice seamless blend between these two colors. Okay, so we'll go ahead and continue around. I believe that's all of them. Let's go ahead and save this. Go back to Maya, and let's go ahead and update these textures and see how things are looking. Okay, so it's a subtle difference, but it's slowly starting to come into shape. So we've got a little bit more of shading, happening at the back end of these claws, and we could always come in and actually add more shading here at a later point in time. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this video at this point, and in the next video we'll keep adding more detail to these claws, things like striations, a little bit of dirt in areas, and really try and finish these claws off. In this video, we'll go ahead and spend some more time further refining the claw textures and start to add a little bit more dirt, some striations, and really just try to finish these claws out. Okay, so here's where we left off in Photoshop, and what I'm going to do is go ahead and pick a color that's a little bit darker than what we started out with for this back portion of the claw, and that's actually this color right here. So what I'll do is go even darker. Okay, and now let's go ahead and with my paintbrush, let's go ahead and try a few different looks here. Looks like a 1 pixel paintbrush will work just fine. And I'm going to go ahead and paint on this same claw layer with the lock transparent pixels turned on. And that way I can just very easily paint these striations in without having to worry about going into the skin texture. Okay, so I'm just going to really quickly go around, and whenever I'm making these striations, I usually tend to start at the beginning portion of the striation, and then similar to what I was doing with the wrinkles, start with a real light pressure and then build up the pressure as you go further back to just make a real nice clean striation. Okay, so I'm just going to really quickly go through and do this for pretty much all of the claws. Okay, just making these real subtle striations and make them a little darker toward the back. Okay, we'll go ahead and do this claw over here. And this part's going to take probably a little bit of time just because there's a lot more strokes that have to happen all the way around. Okay, so we'll go ahead and do this one as well. And once I finish this particular foot, I'll go ahead and save the texture. We can update it in Maya, and we can take a look at what we've got. Okay, so I'll go ahead, and I think I've got one more claw to do. And like I said, this is really where having a pen and a digitizing tablet really comes in handy, to just be able to really make quick work of this. So let's go ahead and at this point, let's save this. Go ahead and go back to Maya and update our textures. Let's see how things look so far. Okay, so here's the textures now on the back feet. Okay, so things are starting to come along. We could always probably go in and add a few more striations into these areas if we needed to, and if it helps, you might also want to go in and just turn off this wireframe if it happens to be just getting in your way. Okay, let's go in and just continue working around. It looked like I needed to add a few more striations to most of these toenails. Okay, there we go. I might actually even zoom out a little bit, just because it's getting a little bit difficult to see my overall workspace. Okay, let's go ahead and add some more striations. Let's go ahead and save this and make sure everything is okay. Make sure I'm not adding too many striations or getting carried away. So let me go ahead and save this. Switch back to Maya, update this texture. Okay, so things are looking okay. Not too bad. So we're starting to now get more detail and more striations and just these little ridges and bumps into the claw. And these will really start to come together at a later point in time when we go in and actually add the bump map to these and really make these realistic looking. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video at this point. I'm going to go ahead and add the striations to these front claws. Okay, and in the next video we'll start to add some of the secondary skin colors to the body. At this point in the training kit, we're going to start to focus a little bit more on the body and starting to focus more on the secondary skin tones and just really starting to add a little bit more detail to the large overall body of this creature. Okay, so here's where we left off with the claws in the last video. Okay, let me go ahead and turn on my UV snapshot, and here's the body that we're going to be working with. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and first of all, let's start working with the underbelly of the creature, which that is actually right here on the sides. This UV layout is actually split right down the middle of this creature's belly. So what I want to do is let's first of all find a lighter color, and I'll try and go ahead and find just a real light gray color should work. And the first thing I want to do now is go ahead and find a brush, and then probably need to fine-tune it in order to get the look that I want. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the brushes palette. Okay, so I'm starting out with this 59 splatter. Okay, now I'm probably at this point going to have to go in and take up this diameter, because what I really want to do is have a larger brush that takes up a little bit more area. Okay, so it looks like something at about 100 is going to be about the right size for this. Okay, now what I can do is start to turn on some of these shape dynamics and really try and make this just look very random, but at the same time very natural. Okay, so what we can do is go to this brush tip shape in the brushes options, and let's start to make some of the same adjustments that we did with a similar area of the face a little earlier in this training kit. Okay, so let's take the spacing out. Looks like it's going to be about 60% spacing. Like I said, I try to usually get the spacing to about the point where these brush patterns just barely start to touch each other. Okay, at the shape dynamics, I really don't want the pen pressure to control the size. Okay, so I'm going to set my pen pressure off, so that way the stroke pretty much stays the same size the whole time. Similar to what we had to do at an earlier point in this kit, I wanted to go in and take the angle jitter up quite a bit. So that way each one of these brush points, it has a completely different rotation, and it gives it that nice random look. Okay, so let's go ahead and maybe add a little bit of scattering to this. Let's say about something about 50%. Looks like that's going to work good. And the opacity jitter, let's go ahead and link that to pen pressure. And that looks like that will do it. Okay, so let's go ahead and close this palette. And the first thing I want to do is let's go ahead and instead of using my pen, what I can do is actually use my mouse. And I guess what I first of all need to do, forgot to make a new layer. So let's call this one, let's say underbelly. Okay, so as I was saying, what I really want to do instead of using my pen to make this first initial stroke, what I'd really like to do is go in and actually use my mouse. And that way what I can make sure that I get is 100% coverage right at this center point. Okay, and that's actually going to be pretty important later on So I have 100% color right at this point in the underbelly. Now I can start to take my pen and start to taper this color out a little bit more. So I'm going to use these same little circular patterns to sort of blend everything together. Okay, and I'll start to carry this white color up a little higher. Okay, one thing that we do want to be aware of is these areas right here where the UV layout actually ends. You're going to want to make really sure that you don't carry this speckled pattern beyond this border, because otherwise what will happen is you'll wind up with this very noticeable edge in the texture. So one thing that we're going to want to definitely be sure of is that we don't cross this line whenever making this speckled pattern. And if we do cross that line, we're going to want to make sure that we at least go in and remove it. Okay, so I'm going to keep making this lighter pattern. And you'll notice that with this speckled pattern up front, I didn't go beyond this this boundary of the UV layout. And again, for the same reason, if I went beyond this line, what we'll wind up with is a very noticeable line in the texture. And unfortunately in Photoshop, that's just something that you kind of have to learn to work around. These problems like this, where it's extremely difficult to get the texture to match up perfectly in some of these areas. So we kind of have to, like I said, in some of these areas, use a little bit of creative deception, more or less. Okay, so what I'm doing right now is switching to my eraser tool and getting an eraser brush set up to where I can go back and erase some of these areas that have crossed over this UV line. Okay, so I'm pretty much setting up a eraser brush that is just like my paintbrush. So a little bit of angle jitter, a little bit of opacity jitter linked to the pen pressure. Okay, and now I can go back and with my eraser tool go back and clean up some of these areas that have crossed over this UV line. Okay, so in the next video we'll go ahead and continue working with this underbelly of our monster. In the previous video, we started to create the lighter texture for the underbelly of our monster. So in this video, we're going to go ahead and continue that process and try and get the underbelly for this monster finished up. Okay, so let's jump back to Photoshop where we left off. Okay, so what I want to do really is just continue this process of getting this underbelly done. So I'm going to come in and just continue around the underside of this monster, again using really these same little small circular patterns to try and blend things in as well as possible. Okay, I'll go ahead and continue this up, and I may need to actually come back in with my eraser and erase away some of these lines that have crossed over this UV border. And again, you'll notice I'm using a lot of these same circular patterns to just very subtly blend some of these back. Okay. So once I've got everything pretty much set up, now I've got this texture for the underbelly made, but I've only got half of it. Okay, I still need to go in and do this half. The problem though becomes now that I've got a underbelly texture that I'm trying to make over here and an underbelly texture on this side, and the fact that there's a UV border here means that it's probably going to be almost impossible to get these two to match up perfectly. But what I can do is get it very close. What I could do is take this underbelly texture that I've made and actually duplicate it and put it over on this side so that they are pretty much seamless. Okay, so let's look at how we can make that happen. The first thing I want to do is, with this underbelly layer, is come in and try to clean things up so that it really ends right at this edge, and that way I know exactly what I need to line up on this side. Okay, so let me show you what I'm talking about. What I'll do is take my marquee tool, and with this underbelly layer selected, let's come in and draw a marquee that encompasses this and all this other just junk of the underbelly texture, and try and butt that up right against this white line. Okay, so once this is in place, what you can do is hit the backspace key on your keyboard, and what that'll do is just clear out everything that falls within this box. Okay, now if I go in and deselect, or just use the shortcut Control D, now I have a very definitive line over where this underbelly texture ends. Okay, so now what I can do with this underbelly layer selected, let's grab it and drag it down to this Create New Layer icon. Now when I let off, what it will do is make an exact duplicate of this underbelly layer. And now what I can do is switch to my Move tool and hold my Shift key to make sure that I drag this directly, perfectly straight across. Okay, I can move this over to the side. Now with this duplicated underbelly, let's go up to Edit, Transform, and let's flip this horizontally. Okay, and what it did is basically just made a mirror image. Okay, so now that I have this very clean line, I know exactly what I need to match up. Okay, so now what we have are two identical textures on the underbelly of this creature. Okay, so what we can do now, let's go ahead and save this. And let's go back to Maya, let's reload this, and take a look at what we've got. Give this just a moment to load up. And so now what this creature has is a white sort of underbelly. And we could come in and manage to clean up most of this, but since this texture is identical on both sides in Maya, it's in Photoshop, I mean, you've got an identical texture here and here, so that way they actually match up perfectly when they come together in Maya. Okay, so in the next video, we'll continue adding some more detail to the skin of our creature. In the previous video, we created the light underbelly for our monster. So in this video, we'll go ahead and start to create the darker areas that run along the monster's back. Okay, and if I take a look at Maya, the areas that I was talking about on the monster's back are these raised ridges right along here. Well, the problem that I run into right now is that if I take a look at Photoshop at the UV texture editor, it's actually very difficult to tell where these raised areas are. I know that they are actually right along the center of the back, but if I wanted to actually make this texture specific so that it's actually darker up at these high points, it's going to be very difficult to tell where those are here in Photoshop. So what I can do is, if I go to Maya and just select UV mode, okay, and if I go in and select these raised areas, which these raised areas are actually the high points of these spines that are on the monster's back, if I select those and go to the UV texture editor, I can now see where those points are on my UV layout. Okay, so I can see that, let's see, it looks like, starting from the neck, from the third intersection from the neck, that's going to be my first spine, which is this one right here. And then it looks like just every other vertex is going to be my high point. Okay, so that at least now gives me a better idea of how I need to lay this out in Photoshop. Okay, so now that I've determined that, let's go ahead and go to Photoshop. Okay, I'll go ahead and zoom in on this area. And the first thing I want to do is pick a darker purple color. So if you recall in an earlier video, I had stored in the swatches a darker purple color. Okay, so I'll go ahead and select that. And now that color becomes active in my foreground color. Okay, I'm actually going to select this and make it a little bit darker than what I've got right now. Okay, so here's the color that I had before. So I'm going to go with something just a little bit darker, maybe something like this. Let's hit OK. And let's go ahead and first of all make a new layer to paint on top of. Okay, now that we've got a new layer set up, let's go ahead and call this dark spine. That's what I'll call it. Actually, I misspelled that. Try that again. There we go. Okay, so now I've got a new layer ready to go. I've got a dark color selected. And now what I need to do is try to find a brush that will work pretty well for what I want to do. So let's go ahead and open up the brushes palette. And let's see what we have to choose from. Okay, let's scroll down. And let's see. Let's go ahead and let's try this one right here. Okay, I believe that is the Chalk 23. Let's try that. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, I think we can maybe make that work. Let's go ahead and make a few adjustments to this. Let's take the spacing up on this. Let's go ahead and turn off the shape dynamics for the size jitter. Or let's turn the size jitter off of the pin pressure. Let's go ahead and go through some of these same techniques that we went through earlier. We'll take the angle jitter up. We'll take the pin pressure and link that to the opacity jitter. Maybe give it a little bit of scatter. Okay, I think we can probably make this work now. Okay, so with these adjustments made, now what we can do is start to go in and paint in some of these areas of the spine. Okay, so if you recall earlier, it was going to be this third vertex down. This is the high point of that spine. Okay, so what we can do is come in and we'll just very lightly come in and make some of these edges, and then the center point will be this darkest area. Okay, so something just very rough like this. Okay, and I believe it was going to be every other vertex now is the high point. Okay, so let's go ahead and move down, skip one, paint this area in, and I'm just going to go very rough at this time. Okay, skip one, paint it in. I just want to make sure at this time that everything pretty much is where it needs to be. Okay, so let's go ahead and test this. Let's save it. Go back to Maya. Okay, and now let's go ahead and reload the texture and see if everything matches up correctly. And it looks like it does. It's kind of difficult to see, but you can see now these dark areas that are on the high point of each one of these spines. And it looks like I actually need to go back and get a couple more. Okay, so let me go back to Photoshop. Okay, from this point, we'll go ahead and skip one. Move down. Paint in this area. Let's go ahead and skip one more. And do this one. Okay, let's save this again. Reload our texture and make sure everything lines up. Okay, it looks like I'm going to need to go in and maybe adjust this one a little bit more. So let me go back to Photoshop. Let me undo this a few steps, and let me actually now paint this one a little further down. Okay, let's save that. Reload it, make sure everything is lined up correctly. Okay, looks like we got it. So now we at least have the rough shape of these darker areas of the spine painted into Photoshop. So in the next video, now we can go ahead and really refine these textures and really make them look like they fit in with the skin. Now that we've created the rough color areas for the spines on the monster's back, we're ready to go in and now modify those darker areas to make them look like they blend into the rest of the skin. Okay, so in Photoshop, here's where we left off with these darker areas of the monster's spine. So now what we can do is come in and really try to adjust these and really make them look like they blend in to the rest of the skin. And the way I'm going to blend that is with the smudge tool. Okay, so with the smudge tool, what I first need to do is probably make some adjustments to the brush. Okay, so we'll go ahead and open the brushes palette and try and pick a small, sort of small, maybe about a size 9 it looks like. Make sure it's a soft-edged brush or a brush with no hardness. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's maybe give this a little bit of scatter. And for other dynamics, I want to make sure I have the strength jitter set to pen pressure. That way, the harder I push, the more it's going to blur, and then as I let off my pen, it's going to let off that pressure and really give me a little bit more control over how I taper this off. Okay, so let's go ahead and make sure everything is okay. Let's test this out. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. And I have my brush strength set to about 65. Okay, so now with my smudge tool selected and these changes I've made to my brush, now we can go in and adjust this dark spine layer. Okay, so what I can do is just really quickly come in and blend this back in to the rest of the skin. And what I'm doing is I'm starting with hard pressure with my pen at the center part of this spine, and then as I move my way out, I'm just letting off my pen to try and taper this back in. And kind of the look that I'm getting right now is a look of almost like stretched skin, which is kind of what I'm going for. So trying to make it look like these darker areas are actually being stretched up and out of this lighter colored skin. Okay, so I'm just going to keep going and just really quickly making some of these adjustments. And I can also come in and just use a series of really light strokes to come in and try to blend away some of these really hard edges that you may come up with. So really quickly, you could come in and maybe blend some of these areas back together, you know, where you've got this really hard color change, and then just come in and with your smudge tool, just really quickly come in and sort of blend this back into the skin. Now for me, I'm going to want to make sure that I actually carry this out a pretty good distance. It looks like in my UV layout that these stretched areas are going a pretty good distance, but you'll see when we go back into Maya that there's really not a whole lot of distance here. The spine in Maya actually starts right here. So we're probably going to want to make sure we at least carry these stretch areas out past this secondary line. So I may need to go back up to some of these areas up here and actually make sure that I do carry these out a pretty good distance. Okay, maybe come back and stretch this a little bit further. Okay, let's go ahead and see how things are lining up. I'm going to go ahead and save this. Let's reload this texture in Maya. Okay, and you can start to see now, if you look very closely, how this is starting to come out. We've now got this area that looks like these spines are starting to stretch up and out from the skin. It's very subtle, and it's kind of hard to see with this specular highlight around the rest of this model. But what you'll see once it comes time to render this, that we've now got these areas that look like they're stretching up and out of the skin, which that's really what we're trying to go for. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the video at this point and go ahead and blend in the rest of these spines, and then in the next video we'll go ahead and add some secondary color to the top part of these spines. Now that we've completed adding the darker color to the back of the monster, we're ready to go in now and start to add in the secondary lighter colors to this monster's spine. Okay, so here's where we left off with Photoshop and the last kit, making these darker areas for the monster's spine. Now let's go in and start to make the lighter areas that will go on top of this. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is select a lighter color. So what I can do is just switch to my eyedropper tool, and let's go ahead and try and grab sort of this lighter gray color that's right here in this channel that runs along the side of its head. Okay, and that's this color that we've now have selected. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at this area that we left off. I also want to go ahead and make a new layer, and we'll call this light spine. Go ahead and make sure I've got that spelled right. Okay, so now that I have this new layer for the light area of the spine, let's go ahead and take a look at our brushes palette. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and use this same number 23 chalk. Okay, let's take a look at this. And I might even make this a little bit smaller, maybe just a little bit, like a 20 or a 21. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and keep that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead, close this layer, and on this light spine layer, I'll go in and just make a quick mark that runs pretty much right through the center of these darker spots. Okay, so we'll go ahead and continue down the back. Okay, got one more to do back here. Okay, so now that I have these darker areas drawn, now let's go in and pretty much go through the same process of smudging these out. So I'm going to jump back over to my smudge tool, and let's try to pick a larger round brush. Okay, it looks like about 45 is what I want. Okay, I also want to, with this smudge tool selected, I want to go to my brushes palette and make sure that shape dynamics is not set to pin pressure on the size jitter. So I want to make sure that shape dynamics is completely turned off. And I want the strength jitter set to the pin pressure. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close that. And now what I can do is just start to taper this lighter area, similar to what we did with the darker areas. Okay, but now it's just going to be an overlaying color. So it looks like this skin now is being stretched up and that it's kind of worn, almost like a real tough, leathery skin. Okay, let's go ahead and continue with these other lighter areas. Okay, we got a couple more to do. And you probably don't want to carry these out quite as far as we did with the darker spots. So really kind of making it look like these lighter areas really sit right at the very top of the spine, like it's just being stretched to that point. So we may actually need to go in and maybe stretch it along the length of the spine a little bit better. Okay, but let's take a look at what we've got. Go ahead and save this. Go ahead and reload this in Maya. Okay, and now what we have along the length of this monster's back is we have now what looks like these spines that are kind of stretching this skin of the back up. Okay, and if you take a look at the back, you can also see how now we've achieved this effect. And this effect will look even better at a later point in time once we put the bump maps on, and it really looks like these spines of his back are just stretching the skin up. Okay, so now in the next video, we'll go ahead and continue adding some more detail to this monster's skin. At this point in the training kit, we're ready to go in and start to add some of the darker blotches to the back of this monster. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open up Photoshop, and here's where we left off in the last video, creating these lighter areas of the spine. So what we're ready to do now is go in and add some of these darker spots to the overall body of this monster. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and switch to my paintbrush tool, and let's go ahead and open up the brushes palette, and let's try and find a brush that is pretty well suited for making these just little individualized spots in the skin. And looking through these brushes, I really don't see anything that I want. I'm really not seeing a brush that it really is going to be good for the look that I want. Okay, so what I can do is within Photoshop, I can actually make my own custom brush that looks just really any way I want. So the way I can do that is, let's first of all just make a new document. So we can go up to File, New, and let's say about 50 pixels by 50 pixels. Okay, and about 72 pixels per inch. I want the background, I want to make sure that it's set to transparent. Okay, now with all those set, let's go ahead and hit OK. And it should just make you a little bitty document that looks pretty much just like this. Okay, so what I can do now is within this document I can make my own custom brush. So let's first of all set just a base shape. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and pick my paintbrush tool, and let's go ahead and let's start with just a large brush. Let's say about a 35 looks pretty good. We'll go ahead and make our initial stroke, and let me actually undo that, and let me switch to a hard edge brush. Bring that size up a little bit. Okay, so now we have just a very simple circular brush. Well, now what I can do is use my smudge tool and actually come in here and modify this shape a little bit. So let's go ahead and set the diameter a little smaller for this. And that's still a little too large. Okay, let's oh, looks like I accidentally minimized that. Let's try this again. Let's try, yeah, that's definitely too large. Let's try something a little smaller. There we go, that's better. Let me go ahead and open up the brushes palette and make sure we have made all the necessary adjustments to this. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, it looks like it's going to be about a 7 pixel diameter brush, no shape dynamics, and strength jitter set to pin pressure. And I might actually lower the overall strength of this brush as well. Okay, I'll go ahead and close that. And now what I can do is come in here and simply make any adjustments that I need to this overall shape. So what I'm looking for is just a very rough, jagged, somewhat organic shape, really sort of more like an age spot. So what I can do is just come in here and use my smudge tool to make any adjustments to this until I come up with a shape that is pretty well suited for what I want. Okay, so let's say that's close. Okay, so if I zoom out to 100%, you can see this is what this shape now looks like. Well, what I can do is now take this shape and make this into a custom brush. So what we can do is, let's go ahead and select all, or Control A. Okay, and what that'll do is just make a selection around everything that you've got. Now what we can do is, with this selection, let's go up to Edit, and let's define brush preset. Okay, and it's going to pull up this little window, and it's going to show you what the brush looks like, what size the brush is, and then it's going to ask you, what do you want to name this brush. So let's just call this something like Age Spot. Hit OK. And now, if you open up the brushes palette, what we should now see is this Age Spot brush ready to use. So in the next video, we'll go ahead and actually start to make these age spots on the texture itself. In the previous video, we created a custom brush in Photoshop to be used as the age spots for the back of our monster. So now that we've created that brush, let's go ahead and start to make these age spots for the monster's back. Okay, so looking back into Photoshop, here's the age spot brush that we created in the last video. So now what we can do is use this brush to make the age spots on our monster. Okay, and we may need to go in before we use this. We may need to actually make some adjustments to this brush itself. Okay, so let's take a look, and you can see, looking at my brush, this is going to be a pretty large age spot. So the size that it is right now is probably going to be too large. Okay, so in the brushes palette, let's go ahead and lower the diameter on this to something looks like about 20. Yeah, it looks like about 20 is going to be about the right size for this. And now what we can do is come in and adjust some of these other attributes. Let's go ahead and take the spacing out a little further. So these have got a decent amount of space between them. Looks like this is about 122%. Let's go ahead and turn on the shape dynamics. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and take the size jitter up quite a bit. Okay, so that way each one of these spots is a different size. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that the angle jitter is up fairly high, so that way these all have a different orientation. And that's the only attribute I want turned on, is the shape dynamics. Okay, so let's test this. Let me undo that a few steps. And let's actually take this size jitter up a little bit higher. And now that I've got this set up to where every time I touch my pen, it'll really put only one dot. But each one of these dots is a completely different, completely random size. Okay, so, and that's really what I want, because now just touching this once in each one of these areas, this gives me a very specific control over where these dots are going to be placed, because I want to make sure that the dots do not cross this line, because otherwise you'll see that as a seam in the texture. So you want to make sure that all the dots that you paint stay within this UV area. Okay, so let's go ahead and make a new layer. For these, we'll call these age spots. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and let's choose this darker purple color from the swatches, and let's see how this looks. Okay, and looks like I'm probably going to want to make these a little bit darker. So let's make these a darker purple. Okay, that's better. So now what I want to do is go through and just add a few random spots. Okay, and some of these spots you may find are coming in a little bit too large. So you may have to do a little bit of just trial and error on maybe undo If you find that some of these spots are coming in still too large, you can always come in and just adjust this diameter down to a smaller size, and then add some smaller spots wherever you need them. Okay, so once I've got just a few random spots placed, let's first of all check and make sure that we don't have any stretching in Maya. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this. Okay, let's go back to Maya and update this. Okay, so here's what the spots actually look like now within Maya. And you may see a few areas that have a little bit of stretching in it, areas like this. It may be possible within Maya to actually go in and adjust these. So let's take a look at the UV texture editor. Okay, let's try and see where this stretching is happening. Okay, and that is this area right here. If we select this UV, we can now see that area becomes active. So let's see if there's anything we can do within this UV texture editor to try and fix some of this stretching. So by adjusting this UV texture editor, we can control how this texture is going to be placed across this surface. And more often than not, you can use this to fine-tune some of these areas, like you see here, that are actually stretching a little bit. And actually make some subtle adjustments to this to make sure that that stretching gets eliminated. So by adjusting a few points, I've actually managed to pretty much eliminate that stretching that was occurring right in this area. So in the next video, we'll continue adding some more of these age spots. In the previous video, we began the process of adding some of the age spots to the back of our monster. So in this video, we'll go ahead and continue that process. Okay, so continuing on from Photoshop where we left off, we started to add some of these age spots in the previous video. Okay, and you can see what those age spots look like on our monster. Okay, so in this video, we'll go ahead and continue moving on with some of these age spots. Okay, so the age spots that we added in the previous video were these darker areas that just ran along the back. But we also need to be able to add some of these spots to the shoulder. Okay, and one thing that you do want to make sure of that I mentioned in the previous video is you want to make sure that these age spots don't pass this line. Okay, because what will happen is if your age spots do cross this line, like I'll just show an example, if your age spots do manage to pass over this barrier, what will happen is within Photoshop or within Maya, if you reload this, what you can see is now this hard edge where this texture is being cut off. And that's basically just because within your UV texture editor, if you look, this line is actually this line on your model. So whenever you're making your textures in Photoshop, you do have to definitely pay close attention to make sure that you don't accidentally wind up with this situation. Okay, so let me go ahead and undo that. Now the next age spots that we want to add are up on this shoulder area. And that's actually this area of the UV layout. So let's go ahead here in Photoshop. Let's go ahead and add some of those age spots to this shoulder area. Okay, and this is actually the front of the shoulder, or the top area, where the shoulder meets up with the back. So let's add a few spots, just in a few places. Okay, and let's go ahead and test this out. Go ahead and save this. Go ahead and reload this in Maya. Okay, so here's what we now have. Okay, now we have these spots that are carrying over from the back pretty much seamlessly into the shoulder. Okay, and you may, like I said in the previous video, you may come up with a few areas like this that have just a subtle amount of stretching. And then typically, if the stretching isn't too severe, you can come in and adjust those within your UV texture editor. Okay, so let me find this UV, see if I can find where this is, and here it is in the UV texture editor right back here, and I'm really looking at this little stretched spot, which I guess that's this one right here. So let's see if we can go in and adjust that in the UV texture editor. And like I said, typically, more often than not, if it's just a subtle amount of stretching, it's usually something that can be fixed relatively easy within the UV texture editor. Okay, so making just a few minor adjustments here and there, you can usually manage to take out some of that stretching. Okay, and we've managed to do that pretty thoroughly. Okay, so in the next video, I'm going to go ahead and pause it at this point and go ahead and continue making the age spots on this side. But in the next video, we'll go ahead and continue to add some more detail to the body. At this point in the training kit, we've pretty much finished up all of the color maps for the creature's body. So now what we're ready to do is, in Photoshop, add some photographic textures to the skin to really finish it off and give it a lot more depth than what we've got currently. Okay, so here's where we left off in Photoshop. At this point, we've got all the age spots completed, and like I said, we're ready to now go in and use some photographic textures to really give this skin a little bit more depth and some more detail, because right now it does still look a little bit flat. Okay, so what I'm going to do is open up this image, and what this is it's pretty much just a photograph of some elephant skin. Okay, and what I want to be able to do is use this as a color map, or as a layer within our color map, to just give a little bit more detail to our skin. But before I can use this right now, we've got a few problems that we have to deal with. First of all, this image really wasn't taken to be able to be used as a 3D texture. So you've got the problem of that it's not a repeating texture, okay, and also it's too large. There's not a whole lot of detail in this. So luckily though, with Photoshop we can take care of both of these issues. The first thing I want to do though is address the issue of this not being a repeating texture. Okay, and basically what that means is this top part of the texture, if you were to wrap it around an object, would not meet up perfectly with this part of the texture. You would definitely see a seam or a line between this area and this area, and same on the two sides. And what we can do within Photoshop is fix that problem so that this texture is a perfectly seamless repeating texture. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. With this skin texture selected, let's go up to Filter, let's go down to Other, and let's go to Offset. Okay, and the Offset will bring up this little window. Okay, we want to make sure that it's set to wrap around, and we want to be able to see what we're working with, so make sure your Preview checkbox is turned on. And basically what this Offset filter will do is, as you crank this slider up, what it's basically doing is moving the pixels from this side of the image and wrapping them around over to this side. So as these pixels start to move off this edge, you can see as I crank this up, these pixels are moving off this edge, but they're reappearing over on this side. So this is what I was talking about earlier, about this not being a perfectly repeating texture. You can definitely see that seam. Okay, so let's go ahead and crank this over, and let's also move this down vertically. So basically, now what used to be the four outer corners of this image now meet right in the center. And now what we can do is use Photoshop to touch everything up and completely remove all of these seams. So what I'll do to make that happen is let's go ahead and use the Healing Brush tool. Let me go ahead and zoom out a little bit. And what I'll do is, first of all, select an area that I want to sample. Okay, so let's say I want to be able to take some of this paint. So with this healing tool selected, hold down your Alt key on your keyboard. Okay, click the area that you want to be able to take the paint from. And now all we have to do is paint onto this area. Okay, let's go ahead and make a few more strokes. And this is going to take a little bit of time to be able to pretty much seamlessly blend everything together. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead now and sample something from this area. Let's sample that, and let's start to paint away this area. Paint that seam away. Okay, let's go ahead and sample some more. And what I'm trying to do is just very lightly try to overlap some of these different sampled areas. Okay, let's go ahead and try and remove this seam. Okay, and you can see what we have here is still not a completely seamless repeating texture. You can still see where some of these repeating areas are happening. So what we can do is just use a series of paint strokes to try and randomize this as much as possible. Okay, so this is pretty close. This is definitely getting better. It's getting to the point now where it's very difficult to be able to see any kind of a seam. So what we can do now, let's go ahead and offset this again. Okay, and I'm just making sure that we do now have a perfectly repeating texture. So this is a good way within Photoshop to be able to determine if the texture that you're going to be using will actually repeat correctly. So as I offset this, you are not able to see a seam anywhere, which means this is now a repeating texture. So in the next video, we'll go ahead and make some more adjustments to this before we're able to use it for the skin texture of our monster. In the previous video, we began the process of adjusting the photograph that will be used as part of the skin texture. So in this video, we'll go ahead and continue to adjust that image so that it's better suited for our monster. Okay, so here's where we left off in the last video. And in the last video, we went ahead and adjusted this image so that it's now a perfectly repeating image. Okay, the problem that we run into now is that if we were to simply take this and drop it onto our existing texture, you can see right now these wrinkles in this texture that we've got are much too large in relation to our overall texture. So what we need to be able to do is actually go in and adjust this image so that the wrinkles are smaller and we have actually more wrinkles to be able to use. And so the way we can do that is, let's first of all, on this background layer, let's double click on this. Okay, and that'll just bring up this new layer dialog box. Just go ahead and hit OK. Okay, and two things happened whenever we did that. First of all, this layer was renamed from background to layer 0. Okay, that's the first thing that happened. The second thing is this lock on the background has now been removed. So now I can actually pick this layer up and move it around to be able to reveal this transparent background behind there. Okay, and that'll come in useful here in just a second. So what I can do with this image is, let's go up to Image, Canvas Size. Okay, and it's going to open up this Canvas Size dialog box. Let's go ahead and make this image, or make the canvas for this image, double the size of what we've got now. So let's say 1200 by 800. Okay, this anchor point will determine where your existing image will wind up. So with it set to the center right now, what will happen is this existing part that we have right now will wind up right in the center of our image. Okay, if I were to undo this, and let's set this back to 1200 by 800, if we were to set the anchor point to this upper corner, now what will happen is this image will wind up in the upper corner, And that's really probably where we want it, just so that it's right where we want it to begin with. So now what we can do is let's duplicate this layer. Okay, let's move it over. Okay, let's duplicate it again, move it down, duplicate it again, and move it over and down. And actually I messed up there. Try that again. There we go. And now what we have is this repeating image. So what we've managed to do now is add actually more wrinkles to this. Since it's a perfectly repeating texture, you really don't wind up with any seams or any hard edges. Okay, so what we can do now is let's select all of these and go ahead and just merge these all together as one layer. Okay, so let's go ahead and merge linked. So now this is one complete layer. Okay, let's take a look at what we've got. Let's drag this down, and now what we have is just one large wrinkle, or one large wrinkle map, more or less. It's still not quite what we want though. Okay, let me go ahead and trash that. Let's go back to this original skin texture layer, and now let's go up to Image, and let's go to Image Size. Now what we can do is let's set this back to the original size that this started out as. So let's say 600 by 400. Okay, and now if we were to take this and bring it down, we now have a smaller wrinkle map to be able to be used in our image, or in our texture. Okay, so in the next video, we'll start to explore the process of making this wrinkle map fit in with our existing texture. Now that we have the wrinkle map created, we're ready to go in and begin integrating that into our existing color map for our monster. Okay, so in the previous video, we managed to create this wrinkle map. But the problem that we run into right now is that the wrinkles are the correct size, but this image is still too small to be able to fit over the entire body. So we have a couple of options that we could do. One would be to get this placed in the area that we want, and then we would have to go in and duplicate this layer and move it over. The problem though with using this method is that you introduce a lot of room for error. For instance, if you were to go in and get this lined up pretty closely, you can see that you still actually wind up with a seam right in this area because these two aren't really matching up perfectly, and it's going to be very difficult to get these to match up perfectly. So rather than trying to go through this entire method, let's go back to this and let's actually make more of a repeating texture here on this original skin image. So to clarify that, what I'm talking about, let's go ahead and go back to canvas size. Okay, and with this skin texture, let's go ahead and take the height and the width back to 1200 by 800. Okay, and I might need to go back and move this back into the upper corner. Now let's go ahead and repeat this texture pretty much the same way that we did the first time around. Okay, so now I have more wrinkles within this area. Okay, let's go ahead, link these together, and merge these. Okay, now I'm ready to go in and take this, drop it down into my existing color map, and now I find that I have just one layer to have to move around that's already got all the repeating textures perfectly lined up. Okay, so what we can do is let's get this roughly into position. And now what we may have to do in order to get this to fit over our existing UV layout is we may need to just slightly stretch this. Okay, so what I can do is let's go up to Edit, and let's free transform, or I usually just use the shortcut, which is Control T. Okay, what we can do now is start to scale this more into shape, okay, so that it pretty much fits over our UV layout. Okay, let's go ahead and hit enter. Now we've got this wrinkle map, but we really need to be able to get our background color to be able to show through this. So we're going to be able to do a couple of things to really make this blend into our existing skin texture. Okay, first of all, let's take this. Let's make this layer called wrinkle layer. Let's take this wrinkle layer and let's lower the opacity. Okay, let's take this down to something like 20%. Okay, so you can now see we're starting to get a little bit more of our skin texture or our background color to show through this wrinkle map, but it's still not completely normal looking. So what we can do is take this wrinkle layer and use an overlay, or use a blend mode, which is going to be set to overlay. Okay, so when I set this to overlay, it does a much better job of blending between this original wrinkle layer and this underlying skin base. Okay, so with these adjustments made, let's go ahead and just take a look at what we've got in Maya. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save this, reload our textures in Maya, and what we should see is this very, very dark area that we just applied this wrinkle map to. It really looks nothing like it did in Photoshop. The reason for that is that Maya has a very difficult time recognizing these overlay, or these blend modes and opacity. So in order to get this to show up in Maya exactly like we have in Photoshop, what we would really need to do is be able to take this wrinkle layer and link it together with this skin base. Okay, and once those two are linked, what we would have to do is merge these together. Okay, so the wrinkle and the skin base have now been merged. Let's save this, reload it, and now what we have in Maya is something that looks exactly like what we had in Photoshop. Okay, so now we're starting to actually get a bit more depth in this skin. Okay, so now that we at least know that things are going to look correct, what we would actually need to do is undo this. Because even though, yes, this does look good, we're going to have a problem later on whenever we go to make the bump maps for this. So for the time being, we still want to make sure that this wrinkle layer is its own individual layer. Okay, we won't merge these together until we're absolutely certain that we've made all the adjustments necessary. So in the next video, we'll go ahead and continue making adjustments to this wrinkle layer and go ahead and get that wrinkle layer placed over the other portions of the body. In this video, we'll continue making some adjustments to the wrinkle layer of our monster's texture. Okay, so here we are where we left off in the previous video. So we've got the wrinkle layer now placed pretty much where we want it, and we've got it set up to where it now fits pretty nicely over the torso of our monster. Okay, so before we move on, I want to go ahead and make a couple of minor adjustments to this wrinkle layer. One of those is that I really don't like in Maya the way that these wrinkles look. Okay, what I really envisioned whenever I was making this creature was having these wrinkles actually have more of a white color inside of the cracks. So a very easy way to do this within Photoshop is to simply inverse the colors so that these black cracks in the skin actually will become white. Okay, so what I can do with this wrinkle layer selected, let's go ahead and go to Image, Adjustments, and let's invert the colors. Okay, or I usually just use the keyboard shortcut, which is Control I. Okay, so let's invert this, and now very quickly And very easily, I now have white cracks in the skin. Okay, and if I wanted to be able to take a look at this within Maya, remember, you would have to take this wrinkle layer and link that and merge it with the skin base. Okay, so now that those two layers become one. Okay, so let's save this, reload this, and now I have something that looks much more like what I originally wanted, where we have this really tough leathery skin with these white cracks that run through it. So that's really more of the look that I originally wanted with this monster. Okay, so now that I know that this looks correct, what I'll want to do is go back to Photoshop and make sure that I undo to the step before I merge this wrinkle layer. Okay, because I want to still make sure that this is its own layer, because I'm going to need to be able to duplicate it to be able to put it on other parts of the body, and then also I'm going to be able to, I need to make sure that this wrinkle layer is separate so that I can use it for the bump map later on. Okay, so let's go ahead and take this wrinkle layer, we'll duplicate it, okay, and we'll go ahead and get this placed over the legs. Okay, and what I'll actually do is free transform this, and let's scale it down a little bit so that it fits over the back legs. Okay, and also let's duplicate this wrinkle layer and move it up over the front legs. Okay, I'll probably need to make sure that it's not actually penetrating this border of the UV layout for the head. So what I may need to do is simply just go in with my eraser and just erase this back. There we go. So we've pretty much got everything set up, and it looks like I actually need to take this up and make sure that we actually do encompass everything within this UV layout. Okay, I'll go ahead and hit enter. Now again, if I wanted to double check this within Maya to see how everything looked, remember, since all of these layers use a blend mode and have opacity on them, we'll have to make sure that these get merged together into one layer. So let's merge these just to be able to see how they look within Maya. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Okay, and now you can start to see this texture that's flowing over this entire creature within Maya. And now this is really starting to add more depth and more detail to this skin. Okay, you may have areas like this within your model, areas around the shoulder where you're getting stretching happening. Okay, luckily though, that's not going to be too difficult to fix. What we can do is just go back to the UV texture editor and make some minor adjustments to this until everything fits correctly. Okay, so we may need to go in and just adjust some of these UVs, pull a few of these in, and there's really not going to be any surefire way of just making sure that you get these this stretching eliminated altogether. But what you can do is just push and pull these points, and you can see now I've managed to eliminate a lot of the stretching that's happening right there in that shoulder area. So you may have to go in and in areas like this and areas down here along this bottom part of the arm muscle, you may need to make a few minor adjustments, and maybe even around this area as well, to make sure that this skin texture doesn't stretch any more than necessary. So in the next video, we'll continue making adjustments to this wrinkle layer. Now that we've finished creating the color map for our monster's body, now we're ready to go in and use Photoshop to start to create some of the secondary maps, like the specular map and the bump map. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at what we've got so far in Maya. So what I've managed to do since the last video is I went ahead and just continued along the same process and went ahead and got the texture applied to the head. And what you should see is, since we did a pretty good job of touching that image up in Photoshop, the image that we use for the wrinkle map, we did a pretty good job of getting that touched up so that there were no seams or creases. So what you pretty much wind up with now is, in these areas where the two UV layouts meet, for instance between the arm and the body, it really becomes almost impossible to see any kind of a seam because of the Photoshop work that we did on that wrinkle map. So that makes a pretty good method of getting image maps that are completely seamless across your different UV layouts. Okay, you may occasionally notice a very slight seam such as this, but that'll be almost impossible to see when you're at, you know, a decent distance from your monster. Okay, so what we can now start to do is start to build up the bump maps and the specular maps for our monster. So let's go ahead and go back to Photoshop. Okay, and here's the map that we've got created so far. Okay, and if you take a look at the channel box, or the layers palette, you can see the different wrinkle layers that we've got. Now, you remember I said earlier that it's going to be important that we have these actually on their own layer. In other words, you need to make sure that they're not merged with this skin base, because we actually need these to be separate in order to make the bump map. Okay, but what we can do is take these wrinkle layers and merge these all together into one single wrinkle layer. So what we can do is, let's link these, let's merge them. Okay, so now we just have one layer that contains all the different wrinkle maps. Okay, now once those have been merged, the blend mode is going to switch back to normal. Okay, so you'll probably have to switch this back to overlay in order to get it exactly the way that you had it. Okay, but while we've got this one single wrinkle layer, okay, now we can use this as the bump map. Okay, so let's first of all take this new merged wrinkle layer. Okay, let's go ahead and duplicate it. So now there's two of them. Now let's take this wrinkle layer and let's drag it up into this bump layer set. Okay, now if I were to turn this layer set on and expand it, it's going to drop the wrinkle layer probably below your layer 2. So you'll probably just have to restack that. Now, Maya, and really just about any other 3D application, whenever you're using a bump map, it's going to use black and white information to determine the bump map. So anything that's white is going to be raised higher in your bump map. Anything that's black or darker in color is going to be pushed down. Okay, well, looking at this wrinkle map, that's really the opposite of what we want. We want these wrinkles to be pushed down instead of being raised up. So what we can do is, this wrinkle layer that's in the bump layer set, let's take this wrinkle layer and let's invert that. Okay, so let's go to Adjustments, Invert, or like I said, I usually just use the shortcut Control-I. Okay, so now what we have are these darker wrinkles, which will now be pushed down whenever we go to make the bump map. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and leave the blend mode at normal. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and turn the visibility off on this. There's a few areas that we probably don't want this bump to be very apparent. For instance, if I turn on the bump map, you can see that the bump map's completely covering this. If I go ahead and turn on the UV snapshot, you can see that the bump's completely covering up this area of the brow, and it's also doing a lot of bumping around the lips, which I don't want the bump to be extremely apparent in these areas. So what I can do is, let's go ahead and first of all, select the areas that I don't want this bump to appear. Another area that I don't want this bump is here in this channel on the side of his head. So what we can do is look in our color layer set, find this channel layer, and let's hold the control key on our keyboard and click on it. Now it's going to say that pixels that are no more than 50%. In other words, since nothing on this layer is more than 50% visible, you won't see any of the marching ants around your outline, but it actually did make your selection, even though you really can't see it. So what we can do with that selection made, let's go ahead and now, let's try that again. Let's control click, hit OK. Okay, so with this wrinkle layer selected, what we can now do is hit the backspace key on our keyboard to clear out that selection. Okay, and you can see as I hit my backspace key more and more and keep removing more and more of that selection, you can start to see now that channel selection that we had made. So basically I want to just clear this out to where it's basically smooth, because like I said, I want this channel actually to be more like a soft membrane that's on the inside of his head. Okay, so in the next video, we'll go ahead and continue making some further adjustments to this bump map. In the previous video, we began the process of making the bump map for our monster. So in this video, we're going to go ahead and continue making the bump map and then start to move on to the specular map of our monster. Okay, so going back to Photoshop, in the previous video, we began the process of removing some of the bump for this channel in the side of the monster's head. So that way when the bump map is applied, this area will still remain smooth. Okay, we've got a few other areas that we need to do the same thing with. For example, this darker area of the monster's face, which is this area right here. I really don't want the bump to show up very much in this area. Okay, so in Photoshop, let's go ahead and keep this wrinkle layer selected within the bump layer set. Okay, and the layer that I was talking about, this area right here in Maya, is this dark blotches layer. Okay, so if I control click on that, you can see how it makes the selection for us. Okay, so with that selection made and this wrinkle layer active, let me go ahead and just turn on this UV snapshot, turn that off so you can see a little better what's happening. Let's go ahead and just hit the backspace key on our keyboard, and basically that's just going to remove the bump from this area. So again, this area will remain quite a bit smoother whenever the bump is applied. Okay, looking at this, another area that I want to have a little bit of bump map is around these lip creases. Okay, so what we can do, let's go back to Photoshop and let's find this lip creases layer. Okay, let's duplicate it and take the duplicate and move it up into this bump layer set. Okay, so if I take a look, you can see here's the lip creases. The problem is though, right now they're white, which means when this bump map is applied, these little lines will be raised out. I actually want those lines to be pushed in. So what we can do is just inverse that. Okay, so now they're black. In other words, now these lines will be pushed in, which is really what we want. Okay, we've got some other areas that we can start to add some more bump map to. These claws, for example. Let's go ahead and duplicate these claws. Move them up. Okay, for these claws, you can see they've actually still got some color to them, which you may want, you may not. If you wanted to be able to remove this color, what you could do is simply select this layer and let's go to adjustments and let's desaturate this. In other words, that'll remove all the color from this layer. Okay. Now these darker lines, that means they're going to be pushed in on the claw, and that's what we want, so that's okay. And I believe that will probably, that should probably take care of it for the most part, for the bump map. Okay, so what we can do now is, before we load this back up into Maya, we'll have to make sure that we take this wrinkle layer. Okay, let's go ahead and turn our bump layer set off. With this wrinkle layer, if you recall earlier, we duplicated this. Let's go ahead and set this back to an overlay mode. Okay, so now that makes this wrinkle a little bit softer. And again, if we want to take a look at this in Maya, we'll have to make sure that, since this layer is using a blend mode, that it's merged with this skin base. Okay, so let's merge these. Okay, we'll give that just a second to think about this. Okay, now let's go ahead and save that. Okay, give it just a second. And once this is saved, now we can take a look at what we've got within Maya. Okay, so I'll reload my textures. Okay, we'll give it just a second to update this. Okay, and now let's take a render at what we've got, because we need to actually be able to render this to see what the bump maps look like. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video for just a moment and render this. Okay, and our render will come back looking something like this. Now you can tell right away that our bump map's set way too high. But you can also see where this bump map, in the areas that we've removed all this bumpiness, you can see how some of our areas are still remaining relatively smooth. Okay, so let's take this bump map and let's definitely tone this down. Okay, let's go ahead and go to a split hypershade perspective view. Okay, what we could do is, if you were to take a look at our monster body material and take a look at the bump node, let's go ahead and select that, hit Control A to open up the attribute editor. Let's take this bump depth and let's lower it quite a ways. Let's say something like 0.05. Okay, with that lowered, let's now take a look at what we get. Okay, now you can see our bump is much more manageable. It's much more realistic. You can see now we've still got a few areas of stretching that are occurring, but we can fix those probably in our UV texture editor. But for the most part, this is starting to really come together now. So in the next video, we'll go ahead and start to add the specular maps for this monster, and then we'll also start to get started on the horns of our creature. Now that we're finished with the bump map and the color map, really all that's left to do in Photoshop is to make some adjustments to the specular map of our monster. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to Photoshop, and really the only area that I want to add any change in the specular map is right around here in this channel that runs around the side of his head. I want everything else on the body to be pretty dull looking for the most part. And really this only part that I want to be shiny is right in this channel, because like I said, that's kind of like a membrane. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's just take this channel layer. Let's go ahead and duplicate it. And we'll take this channel copy and we'll drop this into the specular color. Okay, if we go ahead and turn on this specular layer set, this gray layer that we've got right now for the default color, that's determining the overall shininess of everything in our scene. Right now though, that's a little bit too shiny for the rest of the skin. So what I can do, I'm going to go ahead and just select this color and pick a color that's quite a bit darker than that. Not quite black, but just a dark gray. Okay, so with that dark gray selected, I can go ahead and just fill this layer. Okay, which Alt Backspace was the keyboard shortcut that I used. and Alt backspace will fill with the foreground color, Control backspace will fill with the background color. Okay, so this looks pretty acceptable. I can go ahead and let's double check this. Okay, I want to make sure, again, for preview purposes, I'll probably need to merge these together. Okay, give that just a second. Let's save everything that we've got here. Okay, and now in Maya, let's go ahead and reload this. Give this just a second to update the textures. Okay, and now let's take a look at what we've got whenever we render this. I'm going to go ahead and orbit around. Okay, now let's see what we've got. What we should now have is a very dull looking text, or a very dull looking color around everything except this one little channel, this membrane that's on the side of his head. That should be fairly shiny. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this and render this real quick. Okay, and now that's what I have. I have this dull texture around the skin, and then this very shiny area that runs around through this membrane. Okay, so in the next video, we'll go ahead and start the process of creating the textures for these horns. At this point in the training kit, we're pretty much finished doing all of the work that we're going to do in Photoshop. So from here on out, we're going to use Maya to actually assemble a few shaders to be used for the horns and teeth and the gums. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open up Maya. Okay, and I'm going to go to a split Hypershade perspective view. Okay, and first of all, what I want to do is start off with just a base shader to be used with the horns. So the base color I'm going to go with is just a blend. Okay, and let's go ahead and add a ramp to this blend. Okay, I'll go ahead and middle click, drag this, drop it onto color, and now let's go ahead and right click and assign this to the selection. Okay, so now what we have is just this ramp that runs down along the length of this horn. Okay, so let's make a few adjustments to this ramp. Okay, and it's going to be kind of difficult for you to see, but we're just going to watch as we adjust this ramp, see what we wind up with. So the first thing I want to do is let's take out this middle color, this green. Okay, so what we're pretty much left with is just this red and the blue. So this blue color, let's go ahead and change that to, sort of a dark, sort of off-white. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and make that just a little bit darker. Okay, so that will now, this sort of grayish color will be the tip color for the horn. And we can go ahead and pull this up or down until we get it to where we want it. Okay, for this red color, let's go ahead and choose something that's sort of a dark grayish blue. So I'm going to keep going until I find the color that I want. Okay, something in sort of a dark, because it's sort of a grayish blue. And what we have within our ramp is control over the way that these colors are spread out. So right now it's set to a linear interpolation. So it's going to try its best to blend perfectly evenly between these two colors and from this color up to the next. What you can also do is, instead of linear, you have control over things like exponential up. So in other words, it's going to make a much more gradual transition from this blue into the gray. You can go exponential down, so it'll make a more subtle or a more abrupt transition. And that's actually what I'm going to use. I'm going to use a exponential down. So that way I wind up with a bit more of a solid color down here at the base, and it makes more of a a abrupt transition from this gray down into the blue. Okay, so with this selected, let's go ahead and close this off. And in the next video, we'll go ahead and continue working with this shader to build out the additional features for this horn color. In the previous video, we created just a very simple shader to be used for the horn of our monster. So in this video, we're going to go ahead and continue building out a Maya shader network to be used for the horn. Okay, so here's what we did in the last video, just a simple ramp shader. If you take a look at what we've got, just a simple ramp attached to a blend, and that is the color for our horn. So in this video, let's go ahead and make some more adjustments to this in order to really get this more realistic. Okay, so one of the first features I need to do is to add a bump map to this horn. Okay, so what I really want is for a bump map to have a whole lot of bumpiness to it right here at the base of the horn, and then as it goes down, the bump tapers off until you're left with a relatively smooth, sharp horn at the end. Okay, so really probably the easiest way to do that would be to just simply duplicate the ramp that we've got now. Okay, so what I can do is just select this ramp, hit Control D to duplicate, and now I have an exact copy of that ramp. Okay, what I can do is let's now take a fractal, and this fractal will be the actual bump map. Okay, now to get this bump map to taper up, what I can do is plug this fractal right into this ramp. Okay, so what I can do, let's go ahead and select this duplicate ramp. Let's select this bottom color, and now what we can do is just middle click and drag this fractal right into this selected color. Okay, so now what we have is, if we were to use this as a bump map, we have a lot of bumpiness at the bottom, and then as this transitions up, we have very little bumpiness. Okay, so let's go ahead and connect this to the bump map. Okay, and let's take a look at just what this looks like. Okay, so here's what this looks like rendered. Okay, and this is I'm getting sort of to where I want, but I've still got quite a ways to go. I've got this large amount of bumpiness at the base of the horn, and then it tapers off until we're left with pretty much a smooth horn down at the end. But what I really want is some striations, some streaks of bumpiness that run along the length of this horn, really like a natural horn would. Okay, so what I can do to achieve that sort of effect is, let's go to this fractal that we've got plugged into this ramp being used as the bump, and let's go to this Place 2D Texture node that's attached to this fractal. Okay, if we open this Place 2D Texture node in the attribute editor, what we can do is adjust this repeat UV. Okay, so let's see what this is going to look like. And it looks like I adjusted the wrong one. What we can do is adjust the repeat U and V to either squish or stretch this texture any way that we want. So if we adjust this repeat V, let's say to something like 0.05, what this is now doing is giving it much more of a stretched look. So this should now look more like the striations and streaks that you would normally see in a horn. Okay, so let's take a look at this and see how we're doing. Okay, so now my horn has the streaks and striations that I was really wanting to get in the first place. But you can see that it's still not very natural looking. Okay, so in the next video, we'll go ahead and continue building onto the shader network of this horn in order to get something that's really much more natural looking. In this video, we'll continue the process of building the shader network for our monster's horn. Okay, so in the previous video, here's where we left off with the monster's horn, and I'll go ahead and open up the render view and take a look at what we had in the previous video. We managed to get these striations that ran down along the length of the horn, but before we achieved this look, this is what we originally had. Okay, now I did originally like some of the bumpiness that this had, but I also liked the striations that we had in this one. Okay, so how can I go about achieving a mix, having a shader that has both this bumpiness to it and has the striations that this horn has? Okay, so in this video, that's what we'll do. We'll go ahead and make a shader that has both of these attributes in it. Okay, so here's where we left off with the previous video. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and turn the striations back up on that to where we had them in the previous video. Okay, now what I can do is I'll go ahead and make a new fractal. Okay, and this fractal will be the bumpy one, while this fractal will be the striated one. Okay, what I can do is let's go into this fractal and let's make some adjustments to this so that we wind up with just a few bumps here and there. Okay, so till we come up with a look that's pretty close to this. Okay, go ahead and close the attribute editor. So now what we have are two fractals. One that's a striated fractal, and then one that's just this standard bumpy fractal. Well, what we can do is combine these two into a layered texture. Okay, and you can find the layered texture down about halfway down underneath your nodes. Okay, so I'm going to make a new layered texture. Double click on that to open it up in the attribute editor. And what we can do is take these two fractals and just middle click, drag them in, and you'll probably have to go in and delete this green swatch. So let's just click on that to delete it. Remove this. So what we now have is fractal 1 and then fractal 2. The way that Maya reads these is whichever fractal is in front, or whatever node you happen to have in front, it's going to calculate that as being on top. So what I actually probably want is fractal 2 to be on top. So to rearrange these, what you can do is just middle click, drag them, and that'll readjust the stacking order. Okay, on this fractal 2, what I really want for this layered texture is to be able to see both of these ramps, or both of these fractals within this one image. So what we can do is take this fractal 2 and with this fractal 2, let's try this again. Okay, we'll select the fractal 2, and now what we can do is in the blend mode, let's set this to multiply, which what multiply will do is it will basically take all of the white and make it transparent. Okay, so if you take a look at our resulting layered texture, what we now have is a striated fractal with these little darker spots showing through. Okay, and that should now give us a pretty good result for our bump map. Okay, so let's go ahead and this fractal that we've got plugged into this ramp, let's go ahead and just select this connection and hit delete to sever that connection. Okay, and now let's open up this ramp and let's now drag this layered shader, or this layered texture, into this fractal swatch, or into this ramp swatch. Okay, so now here's what we have for the bump map. So now, with this new bump map made, let's take a look now at what we've got. And now what we have is a horn that has both the striations and the bumpiness of both of the fractals. So that's where you can use a layered texture to achieve some of the looks that would be very difficult to achieve in something like Photoshop. Okay, so in the next video, we'll start to work on the teeth of our monster. In this video, we'll use Maya to create a shading network that can be used for the monster's teeth. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open up Maya, pick up where we left off. So I've got the teeth selected, okay, and we're going to use a method pretty similar to what we used with the monster's horn. So I'm going to go ahead and assign a blend to these teeth. Okay, and let's go ahead and add a ramp to this. There we go. And we'll go ahead and connect this ramp to the color. Okay, if you take a look at how these teeth look, you can see the ramp is actually going the wrong way around these teeth. Instead of going from the bottom up to the tip, it's actually wrapping around lengthwise. So what we can do is open up this ramp, and let's change this from a V ramp to a U ramp. And now this ramp should be going the right way along these teeth. So we'll go ahead and remove this middle color, this green color. And now let's go ahead and select the colors that will be used on these teeth. So the first thing I'll do is let's go ahead and pick sort of a yellowish white, sort of an off-white. Accept that. And then for the base, let's go ahead and pick a darker, sort of grayish color, sort of a grayish yellow. Okay, something to look like this creature's got kind of these real old, worn teeth that have got a lot of plaque on them. Okay, something sort of like this. Okay, we could also, if we wanted to add a little bit more to this, we could also go ahead and add an exponential down or an exponential up. Let's take a look at how this looks. And I'm actually going to pretty much leave this how it is for now. Okay, so we'll go ahead and do something pretty similar to what we did with the horn. We'll go ahead and duplicate this ramp. Okay, and this duplicated ramp is what we'll use for the bump map. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and drop in a fractal. Okay, and just like we did with the horn, I'm going to go to the Place 2D texture of this fractal, and let's adjust the repeat to a fairly small number. Let's say 0.05. Now actually, I'm going to have to adjust it the other direction, because now my ramp is going this way instead of with the horn, which was going vertically. So I'm going to have to adjust my fractal accordingly. Okay, so now with this ramp, let's go ahead and drop this in. Okay, so now I have my bump map. Okay, we can go ahead and plug this into the bump. And let's go ahead and now take a look at what we've got. Okay, and now we've got these very jagged, very pointed, gnarly teeth. Okay, and that's really kind of what we were going for. So the bump map, just like what we had with the horn, the bump map, it starts off very rough at the base of the tooth, and then as you come down to the point of the tooth, it tapers off and just looks like a nice sharp tooth now at the end. Okay, so pretty much the only thing that we have left to do is to go ahead and add the shader for the gums. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Let's start off with a blend. Okay, we'll go ahead and add another fractal for the color. Okay, we'll go ahead and connect this into the color. And just middle click and drag that onto the gums. Now what we can do is, in this fractal, we can go in and adjust the color balance, or in other words, what color this fractal is, with this color balance. Okay, so let's go ahead and adjust the color gain, and what we want to do is find sort of a muted, sort of grayish, purplish color. Okay, just a little bit of pink in there, but really just sort of a gray. Let's go ahead and accept that. Okay, let's go ahead and with this slider, let's go ahead and pick a color that's pretty similar to that. Okay, let's hit OK. And now what we can do is go in and just adjust these sliders a little bit, just so that it looks like this gum has just got a little bit of noise to it. Okay, so now let's take a look at what we've got. Okay, and now we actually have these gums that have got just a little bit of color to them and just a little bit of variation. Okay, so not just a whole lot of color variation or a lot of noise in the gums. Okay, at this point, really all that we have to do is just add a really simple shader for the eye. And for the eye, I really want this to be just a black eye. Okay, just a very shiny eye. Okay, so let's go ahead and assign this to the other side there. And now we've got a completely textured subdivision surface creature. So that concludes the 3D texturing in Photoshop training kit. So thank you very much for spending your time with me, and thank you for supporting Digital Tutors.